This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition, and today we're going to take a look at the Mirr creature type. Mirr made their debut in the artifact-heavy Mirrodin block, and, unsurprisingly, they're all artifact creatures. In the lore, they were originally mindless drones created by Memnarch, the villain in the original Mirrodin block. Once Memnarch was defeated, many of them developed their own consciousness though, so we've seen them on subsequent visits to the plane as well. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the Mirr creature type or be able to make a Mirr creature token. In all, there were 51 cards eligible for this list, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 Mirr in Magic. At number 10, it's Palladium Mirror. For 3 generic, it's a 2/2 that can tap for 2 colorless mana. Lots of Mirror can tap for mana, but this is the only mana producing Mirror to make the list. Obviously, the stat line isn't what you're usually looking for, but potentially having 6 mana on turn 4 is definitely something that should tempt you. Unsurprisingly, this Mirror was played in standard ramp decks that wanted to put Primeval Titan into play as early as possible or cast Green Sun Zenith to search up something awesome. Palladium Mirror hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard. At number 9, it's Miran Besiege. For 2 generic and a blue, it's an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield you choose either Phyrexian or Mirran. The Mirran option is what gets it on this list, since it makes you a 1/1 Mirror token anytime you cast an artifact spell. This can help you quickly go wide and pressure your opponent, and it gets better the more artifact payoffs you have in your deck. The Phyrexian option lets you draw a card and discard a card at the beginning of your instep, and if there are 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses the game. This lets you rip through your deck fairly quickly, and in the right deck you can really threaten to use this alternate win condition. Mirrodin Besiege was printed in Modern Horizons, and that means the only 60 card formats it has ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. Mirrodin Besiege gained all of its points in Modern between 2019 and 2020, during which time it was played in Urza Lord High Artificer decks. Urza lets you tap artifacts you control for mana, and obviously if you've chosen the Mirran option and have a deck loaded up with cheap artifacts, it isn't that hard to produce a ton of mana, and if you mix in some card draw, it isn't impossible for you to combo off. Additionally, the deck is very capable of winning the game with the Phyrexian mode. Mirrodin Besiege didn't have a ton of staying power in Urza decks though, and while decks built around that powerful legendary creature are still a big part of Modern, Mirrodin Besieged isn't. Still, Mirror aren't printed so frequently that Mirrodin Besiege is in any real danger of falling off of this list. At number 8, it's Genesis Chamber. It has 7 points just like Mirrodin Besieged, but more first tier top 8s, so I gave it the edge. For 2 generic mana, if this artifact is untapped, it makes a 1/1 Mirror token whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield. Note that this effect is symmetrical, so your opponent can benefit from it too. It's seen play in artifact decks in Block Modern and Vintage, with the idea being that artifact-heavy decks can get way more value out of all those artifact bodies than other decks can, so it tends to break the symmetry of the card. Plus, the decks that run it are usually all in on artifact aggro, so they're already going to get more tokens than the opponent is. It doesn't have any points since 2014. At number 7, it is Urclaw Mir. For 2 generic mana, this is a 1/1 that gets +2/+2 until end of turn when it gets blocked, and it has Infect, which means it does combat damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and to players in the form of poison counters. A player who has 10 poison counters loses the game. The stats boost effect and Infect on the same card is a nice combination. Being a 3/3 when it gets blocked makes it hard to block effectively in the early game, but you also don't really want to be taking a hit from this because you don't want to get poison counters. Infect decks in Block Standard and Modern are all about boosting Infect creature stats really efficiently, and usually at instant speed, meaning that letting this Mirror through can often just mean you lose the game on the spot. It hasn't gained any points since 2018. At number 6, it's Mir Battle Sphere, which has the same score as Urclaw Mir, but more first tier top 8s. For 7 generic mana, it's a 4/7, and when it enters the battlefield you get 4 1/1 Mirror tokens. When it attacks, you can tap X untapped Mirror, and if you do, it gets +X+0 until end of turn and does X damage to the defending player. On the face of it, this gives you a ton of bodies for the cost, and the attack trigger can allow you to do a ton of damage, especially if you have more Mirr around than just the 4 that this makes for you. 7 mana is a big investment, but the Sphere has always been played in decks that could get it into play way ahead of schedule. In Standard it was played in ramp decks, and in Vintage it was played in Mishra's Workshop decks, which could power it out early with lots of sources of artifact fast mana. Mir Battle Sphere has been inactive since 2016 though, as there are just better things to ramp into these days. At number 5, it's Origin Spellbomb. For 1 generic, this is an artifact that comes with an activated ability that costs 1 generic, and you tap it and sacrifice it, and you get a 1/1 Mirr token. When the Spellbomb goes to the graveyard, you can also pay a single white mana, and if you do, you draw a card. In other words, when you sacrifice this to its own ability, you can also get a full card back. This also works if you sacrifice it by other means too. It gained all of its points in the block and Standard of 2011, where it was played in Tempered Steel decks, which, as you can imagine, were all about getting a ton of artifact creatures into play. The Spellbomb could help you get there, and the deck also ran lots of cards with Metalcraft, so getting an artifact into play on turn 1 was pretty important. At number 4, it's Perilous Mirr. For 2 generic, this is a 1/1 that does 2 damage to any target when it dies. This, of course, makes it great sacrifice fodder, as adding a shock effect to any sacrifice effect can be pretty insane. Even without considering that, the Mirr is a frustrating creature to play against, as it isn't very easy to remove without your opponent generating at least some value from it when you kill it. In block and Standard, it was played in an artifact-centric version of Red Deck Wins, which could sacrifice it to Artillerize or Koldatha Rebirth, and you can see how stapling shock to those effects is a big game. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard. At number 3, it's Shrine of Loyal Legions. For 2 generic, this is an artifact that gets a counter at the beginning of your upkeep, and anytime you cast a white spell, you can pay 3 and sack it to put a 1/1 Mirr into play for each counter that was on it. If you have a deck loaded up with cheap white spells, the Shrine can quickly have a huge stack of counters on it, at which point it can threaten to add so many bodies to the board that your opponent will be completely overwhelmed. It was played in the block and Standard Tempered Steel decks I mentioned earlier. In that deck, the tokens are usually 3/3s or larger, making it even harder for your opponent to find a way to win. However, even once Tempered Steel decks ceased to be a factor in Standard, the Shrine continued to see play in the format in Intangible Virtue token decks, which could turn them all into 2/2s with Vigilance. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard. At number 2, it's Mir Enforcer. This is a 7 mana 4/4 with affinity for artifacts, which means it costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you have in play. Original Mirrodin block was loaded up with lots of cheap artifacts, even artifact lands. There were so many of those things around that it was possible to play the Enforcer on turn 1 and eminently doable to play it on turn 2. This kind of size was hard to contend with in the early stages of the game in all formats. Ultimately, lots of cards got banned in block and Standard to weaken affinity decks. Chief among them were those artifact lands, and that made the Enforcer a lot worse, so it didn't see much play in those formats after that. It managed to see a bit of play when affinity decks were ported to Modern in 2011, but it didn't really find success there until more recently, after the printing of new artifact lands in Modern Horizons 2. It also sees play in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, and that format's version of Affinity. While it's definitely going to keep adding to its score, so is the card in front of it, and they are pretty much neck and neck. For now though, that number 1 card is Mir Retriever. For 2 generic, the Retriever is a 1/1, and when it dies you return another artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a nice effect in general, as it can generate serious value when it dies, but the Retriever is at its best in decks that can really abuse that death trigger and turn it into a combo. While it has some play in both block and Standard affinity decks, it was far from a fixture in them. It has found the most success in Modern, where it was played in Krark Clan Ironworks decks. This deck featured one of the most complicated combos ever to appear in a Tier 1 deck. I'm not going to go crazy deep on the combo here, as I have gone in depth on it in the past in both a deck history video and my top 10 on the best Modern decks of all time, but suffice it to say, you could use the Ironworks alongside the Retriever and Scrap Trawler to create a loop that results in a ton of mana. Ultimately, Krark Clan Ironworks got banned out of Modern to put an end to this deck that was both too powerful and took forever to combo off. It hasn't found a new home in Modern since the banning, but it does see play in Pauper artifact decks where it's likely to keep gaining points. So those are the top 10 Mirr. If you're interested in making a Mirr deck, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in this video. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future MTG top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past top 10s, including many more that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do both of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.